I'm Karen Harrell. At 68, I thought I knew my place in this world, dutiful wife, proud mother, keeper of our family home. Then my son sold that home out from under me in 48 hours. What he didn't know was that I still had one signature he couldn't forge, mine. Before we begin, click subscribe, like this video and tell me in the comments where you are watching from. Your support helps us bring more thrilling stories, and trust me, you won't want to miss them. Now let's get to the story. The dining room glowed like something out of a magazine that night, my best Wedgwood china catching the candlelight, the sterling silver gleaming against the ivory tablecloth I'd ironed that morning until my fingers cramped. Stephen had opened the good wine, the Bordeaux we'd been saving since David's wedding, and the scent of rosemary from the roasted chicken still hung warm in the air. Across from me sat our son, David, 40 years old and dressed like he'd come from a board meeting rather than a family dinner. His wife Mara picked at her salad, pearl earrings swaying as she glanced at her phone beneath the table. Stephen hummed, that old tune from our wedding song, as he carved the chicken with the bone-handled knife his father had given us. For a fleeting moment, I let myself believe we were still whole. "Mom," David said, setting down his fork with the kind of precision that made my stomach tighten. His voice had that rehearsed quality I'd heard him use with investors. "There's something we need to discuss." I smiled, napkin still in my lap, expecting news about the grandchildren. Maybe Emma had made honor roll, or Lucas had finally decided on a college. Perhaps they'd planned a surprise trip. David had always been thoughtful that way, hadn't he? "We've accepted an offer on the house," he said, each word landing like a stone in still water. "The relocation to Denver came through faster than expected, and the market's too good to wait. We close in 2 days." The room didn't spin. It crystallized, every detail suddenly sharp and cutting. I heard the words, but my mind couldn't arrange them into sense. "We've accepted an offer. The house. 2 days." My fork slipped from my fingers. The metallic clink against the china plate sounded like a bell tolling, marking the end of something I couldn't yet name. "Wait," I whispered, looking from David to Stephen, searching for the punchline, the misunderstanding, something. "What house?" David's expression didn't change. "Professional. Measured. This house, Mom. The family property. The buyer's already secured financing. It's a clean sale, Mara's cousin is developing the land. We're getting an excellent price." The words, developing the land, hit me like ice water. Not buying our home. Erasing it. Stephen's wine glass trembled in his hand, a tiny earthquake I might have missed if I hadn't been watching him so desperately. His eyes, those soft brown eyes that had looked at me with love for 43 years, slid away from mine like a coward fleeing battle. And that's when I knew. "Stephen?" My voice barely carried across the table. "You knew about this?" His silence was louder than any confession. David continued talking, something about capital gains, market timing, square footage per dollar, but the words dissolved into static. All I could hear was the sound of my own heartbeat and the single, devastating thought circling my mind. "They've already decided. Without me. As if I don't exist." "The offer came through last week," Stephen finally admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "David said he'd talk to you before anything was final. I didn't want to ruin your birthday, Karen." I thought. "You thought what?" The steadiness of my own voice surprised me. No tears. No shouting. Just a cold, clear question that seemed to freeze the entire room. Mara shifted in her seat, suddenly fascinated by her napkin. David straightened his shoulders, his jaw set in that stubborn line I'd seen 1,000 times, the same expression he'd worn as a teenager when he'd wrecked the car and blamed the weather. "It's the right move for us," he said. "For our family. The schools in Denver are excellent, and the business opportunities. Your family." I repeated the words slowly, tasting their bitterness. "And what about this family? What about the home your father and I built with our own hands when you were still in diapers?" "Mom, you're being emotional." "Damn right I'm emotional." The words erupted before I could stop them, shattering the careful composure I'd been clinging to. This isn't just property, David. This is 40 years of my life. Every wall in this house, I painted. Every floorboard, I refinished. Your father nearly broke his back building that deck you're so eager to let someone bulldoze. David exchanged a look with Mara, that infuriating, patient expression people use when they're waiting for a child to finish a tantrum. The market won't stay this strong, he said, as if explaining basic arithmetic. And honestly, this place is too much for you both. The maintenance alone is none of your concern, I finished, my voice dropping back to ice. Because last I checked, this house belongs to your father and me. Something flickered across David's face then. Not guilt. Something closer to calculation. Actually, he said, reaching into his briefcase and pulling out a folder thick with papers, the property transferred to my name 3 years ago. When we did the estate planning, remember? You and Dad signed everything over to avoid probate issues. The room tilted. I did remember signing papers. David had explained it was just standard stuff, making things easier for everyone when the time came. Stephen had been recovering from his first heart scare, and I'd been so focused on his health that I'd barely read the documents. Just a formality, David had said. Trust me, he'd said. I looked at my son, this man I'd raised, sacrificed for, loved with every fiber of my being, and saw a stranger wearing his face. You planned this, I whispered. Both of you. Stephen's face crumpled. Karen, please. But I was already standing, my chair scraping back with a sound like a scream. The birthday cake sat untouched on the sideboard, its 68 candles unlit, waiting for a celebration that would never come. Get out, I said quietly. Mom. Get out of my house. The words tore from somewhere deep and primal, a place I didn't know existed until that moment. David flinched. Mara grabbed her purse. Stephen sat frozen, tears streaming down his face, but I couldn't look at him, couldn't bear to see the man I'd trusted become so small. After they left, after the front door closed with a terrible, final click, I stood alone in the dining room that still smelled of rosemary and betrayal. The candles had burned down to nothing. The wine had gone warm in the glasses. I walked through the rooms like a ghost touring her own haunting, touching the walls where I'd marked David's height each birthday, the window frame Stephen had repaired a dozen times because I loved the original wood, the piano bench I'd refinished while pregnant and determined to give my child beauty. Every corner held a memory. Every memory held a piece of my soul. And my son wanted to erase it all for square footage per dollar. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat at the kitchen table with every document I could find, old mortgage papers, refinancing agreements, the estate planning folder David had left behind in his hurry to escape my rage. And that's when I found it. Buried in the Third Amendment to the property transfer, in language so dense I'd needed a magnifying glass to read, joint tenancy with right of survivorship, requiring consent of all listed parties for disposition of property. My name. Still binding. Still powerful. Still mine. As dawn broke through the kitchen window, the same window where I'd watched 40 years of sunrises, I felt something shift inside my chest. Not hope, exactly. Something fiercer. David had forgotten that I wasn't just a name on his paperwork. I was the woman who'd built this house from nothing. Who'd raised him through colic and algebra and heartbreak. Who'd stood beside Stephen through layoffs and illness and the grinding work of making a life worth living. And I was done being erased. I picked up the phone and dialed the county clerk's office the moment they opened. Yes, I said, my voice steady as stone. I need to verify the ownership requirements for a property sale. I believe there's been a mistake. Stephen and I were 25 when we bought this land. Not the house, just the land. A half-acre plot on the eastern edge of town where nothing grew but crabgrass and the neighbors' discarded tires. The real estate agent had called it a fixer-upper opportunity, which was code for nobody else wants this dump. We couldn't afford much else. Stephen was working double shifts at the plant then, coming home with grease under his fingernails and that off-key humming that meant he was bone-tired but still trying. I worked mornings at the diner, the kind of place where truckers left quarter tips and coffee refills were endless, and evenings doing bookkeeping for Schmidt's Hardware. We saved every penny that didn't go to rent or ramen noodles, stuffing cash into a coffee tin we kept hidden in the back of the closet. One day, Stephen would say, counting out the bills on our thrift store kitchen table, "We're going to build something that lasts." He meant the house. But I thought he meant us. It took 3 years to save enough for the foundation. Stephen poured the concrete himself with his brother Mike and 2 guys from the plant, Jimmy Rodriguez and Big Tom, who wasn't actually that big but had a voice like thunder. I remember watching them work in the July heat, shirts plastered to their backs, Stephen's face red as a beet but grinning like he'd won the lottery. The sun was merciless that day. I brought them water every hour, watching Stephen mix and pour, his muscles straining as he smoothed the wet concrete with a screed board Mike had borrowed from his construction job. They worked from dawn until the mosquitoes came out, until the last section was level and true. When they finished, Stephen washed his hands with the garden hose and carried me across the wet concrete in my bare feet, both of us laughing like idiots, and kissed me so hard I tasted salt and sawdust and possibility. "Right here," he said, setting me down in what would become our kitchen. "This is where we'll have breakfast every morning for the rest of our lives." And we did. For 40 years, we did. The walls went up slowly, weekends and holidays, borrowed tools and salvaged lumber. Stephen built the frame himself, measuring 3 times before every cut because we couldn't afford mistakes. Every 2x4 represented hours of overtime, every sheet of plywood a week of tips carefully saved. I learned to hang drywall, to mud seams until my shoulders screamed, to paint trim with the patience of a monk because Stephen said corners showed the quality of a home. My hands blistered, then calloused, then became strong. I'd never felt so capable in my life. We moved in before the house was finished. Lived with exposed studs in the bedroom and a bathroom that was just a toilet surrounded by plastic sheeting. But it was ours. Every imperfection, every unfinished corner, ours. Our first Christmas in the house, we had no furniture except a card table and 2 folding chairs. The heat wasn't hooked up yet, so we wore our coats inside and drank hot chocolate by a space heater that barely cut the chill. David was 2 years old, toddling between rooms in his footed pajamas, delighted by the echo his voice made in the empty spaces. Stephen played carols on a battery-operated radio, the same station that's still on the air, still playing the same songs. We danced in the unfinished living room, all 3 of us, spinning and laughing and believing we had everything we'd ever need. I can still see David's face that night, lit up by the glow of the space heater, his chubby hands clapping off rhythm to Jingle Bells. Stephen lifted him onto his shoulders and waltzed him around while I watched from the card table, my heart so full it ached. That was the house I remembered. The house built with bloody knuckles and dreams. But houses settle. And so do marriages. I'm not sure when Stephen stopped fighting with me and started just accepting everything. Maybe it was after his father died and left him that old workshop full of tools Stephen never learned to use, table saw, lathe, drill press, all gathering dust in the backyard shed. Maybe it was the first layoff, when I had to take on extra shifts and he stayed home with David, feeling like less of a man because I was paying the mortgage. Or maybe it was just erosion. The slow wearing away of 2 people who loved each other but forgot how to be partners. Stephen became the man who nodded. Who said, "Whatever you think is best," even when I desperately needed him to have an opinion. Who hummed his tunes and fixed what broke but never questioned why things kept breaking. "Stephen, we need to talk about David's grades." "You handle it, honey. You're better with that stuff." "Stephen, the property taxes went up again." "I'm sure you'll figure it out." "Stephen, I'm scared." "It'll be fine." "It always is." Except it wasn't. And he never noticed. I remember one night, about 15 years into our marriage, lying awake beside him while he snored softly. I tried to talk to him about feeling overwhelmed. David was struggling in school, my mother had just been diagnosed with cancer, the car needed new brakes we couldn't afford. Stephen had listened, nodded, then said, "You're doing great, hon, you always figure things out." Then he'd kissed my forehead and fallen asleep. I'd stared at the ceiling crack, the one that's still there, and realized I was alone. Not physically, but in every way that mattered. I was carrying our life by myself. That should have been my wake-up call. Instead, I just got better at carrying things. David grew up watching his father disappear into passivity, and me pick up every piece Stephen dropped. Maybe that's why our son learned that taking was easier than asking. That decisions were made by whoever grabbed the pen first. We gave him everything. Private tutors when his grades slipped in middle school, $60 an hour we didn't have, paid for by me picking up weekend shifts. A car for his 16th birthday, a used Honda Civic we bought from Schmidt's nephew, still reliable but affordable. Stephen taught him to change the oil, check the tire pressure, all the practical things fathers teach sons. College tuition we couldn't afford, paid with a second mortgage I worked 3 jobs to cover. Stephen had wanted David to go to community college first, save money, but I'd insisted. He deserves the full experience, I'd said. We can make it work. So we did. Stephen took night shifts. I worked myself to exhaustion. And David went to state, joined a fraternity, made connections that would serve him well in business. He never asked if we were okay. Never seemed to notice that we wore the same clothes for years, that we never took vacations, that the house repairs got put off indefinitely. When he wanted to start his business after graduation, Stephen co-signed loans without reading the terms because he's our son, Karen. We have to support him. I'd felt uneasy even then, watching Stephen sign papers he didn't understand, backing debt for a business venture David had explained in buzzwords and optimism. But I'd told myself that doubt was just fear. That good parents believed in their children. I told myself we were building his future. Investing in his success. But somewhere along the way, David stopped saying thank you. Stopped asking if we needed anything. Started treating our sacrifices like they were simply what he deserved, a debt we owed for bringing him into the world. The business took off, and David started wearing expensive suits and talking about portfolio diversification and leveraging assets. He'd visit for holidays, distracted by phone calls, explaining complex financial strategies I didn't understand but nodded along to because I was proud he was doing so well. He bought a house in the suburbs, one of those modern constructions with all glass and sharp angles, nothing like the home we'd built with our hands. Mara decorated it with furniture from catalogs I couldn't afford to browse. They had cleaning services and lawn care and a life that looked nothing like ours had at their age. I told myself I was happy for him. That this was what we'd worked for, to give our son a better life than we'd had. But sometimes, watching him check his phone during Thanksgiving dinner, I'd wonder if better meant something different than I'd thought. 3 years ago, David came to visit with a briefcase full of papers. Stephen had just come home from his first heart scare, a warning, the doctor called it. Not a heart attack, but close enough to terrify us both. I was exhausted from nights at the hospital, terrified of losing him, overwhelmed by medical bills and prescriptions and the sudden, crushing awareness that we weren't young anymore. David spread the papers across this same dining table like he was doing us a favor. "You need to update your estate planning," he'd said, his tone professional, almost clinical. "Get everything organized now, avoid probate later. It's just smart planning, especially given Dad's health." He'd used words like trust structure and tax optimization and asset protection. Made it sound so reasonable, so responsible. Like any good son would do this for his aging parents. What does it mean? I'd asked, looking at the dense legal text that seemed to swim before my tired eyes. It's just transferring the deed into a family trust, David explained patiently. You'll still live here, obviously. This just makes things cleaner when the time comes. Protects you both from probate fees, estate taxes, all that complicated stuff you don't need to worry about. Stephen was too tired to read them, still weak from his hospital stay. I was too scared to ask questions that might make me seem foolish in front of our educated, successful son. We'd raised him to be smarter than us, after all. Wasn't this proof we'd succeeded? It transfers ownership. I'd asked. On paper, David had said. But you retain all rights of occupancy. It's a technicality that saves thousands in legal fees down the road. Trust me, I've consulted with my attorney. This is standard stuff. Trust me. Those words should have been a red flag. But they came from my son, and I'd spent 40 years believing that trust within family was automatic, sacred, unbreakable. Where do we sign? I'd asked. David smiled, warm, reassuring, the smile of a boy I'd rocked to sleep 1,000 nights, and pointed to the lines. I remember feeling a twinge of something then. A whisper of doubt, like a draft through a crack in the wall. Stephen's hand shook slightly as he signed, and I'd covered his hand with mine, thinking I was offering comfort. But the discomfort lingered. That night, after David left, I'd asked Stephen if he understood what we'd signed. David knows what he's doing, Stephen had said. He went to business school for this kind of thing. But it felt strange. Signing away the house. We didn't sign it away. We just put it in trust. He said we'd still live here. I know, but... Karen, please. I'm tired. Stephen had closed his eyes, and I'd heard the exhaustion in his voice, seen the gray tinge to his skin. Can we not worry about this tonight? David's trying to help. So I'd let it go. Pushed down the unease. Told myself that doubt was just my generation's distrust of anything we didn't fully understand. Trust your son, I'd told myself. He's just trying to help. That signature took 3 seconds. It would take 3 years to understand what I'd given away. Now, sitting in the kitchen where Stephen once promised me a lifetime of breakfasts, I understand what we built. Not just a house. A monument to our own diminishment. Every wall we raised together became a wall that separated us, Stephen retreating into silence, me into martyrdom, David into entitlement. We'd built this home with love, pouring our youth and strength and hope into every beam and nail. We believed that the physical structure would somehow contain and protect the love that built it. But houses are just wood and concrete. They can't hold love any better than they can hold water. Love requires tending, defending, choosing again and again to fight for what matters. And somewhere along the way, we'd all stopped fighting. Stephen stopped fighting for our partnership. I stopped fighting for my own voice. David stopped fighting to be anything more than the sum of his portfolio. We built this home with love. And now it's being torn down by signatures. The morning after my birthday dinner, I woke to the sound of Stephen's alarm, 5:45 a.m., the same time it had gone off for 40 years. He shuffled to the bathroom, turned on the shower, began his routine as if the world hadn't just collapsed around us. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling crack, that jagged line that had been there since the '94 earthquake. 29 years, and Stephen still hadn't fixed it. Every morning I woke to that reminder of how some damage becomes permanent simply because no one bothers to repair it. When I heard him go downstairs, I rose slowly. My joints protested, knees that remembered too many double shifts, shoulders that recalled years of scrubbing floors and hanging drywall. My body was a map of all the work I'd done to build this life. I didn't follow Stephen downstairs. Not yet. Instead, I walked. Through the hallway first, where framed photographs documented our family's evolution in reverse chronology. I started at the end, with the most recent photos, and worked backward through time. David's wedding, 5 years ago. He and Mara on the courthouse steps, both in elegant but understated clothes. We wanted something intimate, David had said, which was code for, we didn't want to spend the money on your kind of people. Stephen and I stood awkwardly to the side in the only photo we appeared in, looking exactly like what we were, working-class parents out of place in their son's upwardly mobile life. I touched the frame. My fingerprints smudged the glass, and I didn't wipe them away. Further back, David's college graduation. Cap and gown, diploma held high, that smile I'd once known so well already transforming into something more polished, more distant. Stephen and I had driven 8 hours to attend, stayed in a Motel 6 because the hotels near campus were too expensive. David had thanked us quickly, distracted, already looking toward his future. David at 18, 17, 16. The photos growing warmer as they traveled backward through time. David at 12 holding his first-place science fair trophy, grinning gap-toothed and genuine. David at 8 covered in mud from the backyard, laughing. David at 5 in the inflatable pool Stephen had bought secondhand, arms spread wide like he could hold the whole world. Where had that boy gone? When did he stop looking at us like we were his whole world and start seeing us as obstacles to manage? The oldest photo, David as a newborn, impossibly small in my arms, his face scrunched and red. I was 28 in that picture, exhausted and terrified and absolutely certain I would do anything, to protect this tiny person. I'd kept that promise. But somewhere along the way, protection had become enabling. Love had become surrender. I moved to the living room, where the piano stood against the wall like a monument to abandoned dreams. I'd saved for 2 years to buy it. Worked overtime shifts at the diner until my feet bled into my shoes. Skipped buying myself anything that wasn't absolute necessity, wore the same 3 outfits in rotation, cut my own hair, made do with shoes that were falling apart because every dollar went into the piano fund. I'd imagined filling this house with music. Teaching David to play. Maybe learning myself, finally having time for something that was just mine. David took 6 months of lessons before declaring piano boring. The teacher said he had natural talent but no discipline, a comment I'd laughed off then but understood now as prophetic. He wanted the accomplishment without the work, the result without the sacrifice. The bench still held his beginner books, pages yellowed and curling. John Thompson's teaching little fingers to play. He'd gotten through page 12. I sat down and pressed middle C. The note rang out, slightly flat, into the silent house. When was the last time anyone had played this piano? When had it transformed from an instrument to furniture to just another thing taking up space in a house my son was planning to demolish? I ran my hand along the mantel Stephen had carved from reclaimed oak from a barn his grandfather had built in 1923, wood that held 3 generations of history. Stephen had spent 6 months on that mantel, working in his backyard workshop every evening, coming to bed with sawdust in his hair and splinters in his palms. I'd pulled out those splinters with tweezers while he told me about the wood grain, how you had to work with it, not against it, or the whole thing would crack apart. Just like marriage, he'd said, kissing my forehead. You work with the grain, not against it. I wondered if he remembered that. Or if memory, like everything else, had become something he'd delegated to me. The living room walls held our life in layers, the faded rectangle where David's baby swing had hung, the small dent where Stephen had dropped a hammer during repairs, the pencil marks on the doorframe documenting David's height from age 2 to 16. The last mark, dated August 2003, 5 feet 11 inches, David, age 16. He'd stopped letting us measure him after that. Too old for such childish rituals. I pressed my palm against those pencil marks, feeling the slight indentations in the paint, and something inside me cracked. The coffee maker gurgled in the kitchen. Stephen would be sitting at the table by now, newspaper spread before him, reading headlines he'd forget by lunch. The morning ritual, unchanged for decades. I found him exactly where I knew he'd be. Reading the sports section, Stephen, who'd never cared about sports in his life. Morning, he said without looking up. Coffee's fresh. I poured myself a cup, my hand steady despite everything churning inside me. I sat across from him and waited. He turned a page. The paper rustled. I waited. Another page. He took a sip of coffee, still not meeting my eyes. Stephen. He lowered the paper slowly, like a man preparing for an unpleasant task. His face looked older in the morning light, the creases deeper, the gray more pronounced. When had he gotten so old? When had we both? We need to talk about last night, I said quietly. He sighed, that long, weary sigh I'd come to know so well. The sigh that meant why must you make things difficult? David told me a week ago, he said, still not quite meeting my eyes. He called while you were at book club Tuesday. Said he'd been working on this for months, that he'd found a buyer, a developer. The offer was good, really good. Time sensitive, though. Had to move fast or lose it. And you said what? Stephen's hands tightened around his coffee mug. I said I'd need to talk to you. But you didn't. He asked me not to. Said you'd get emotional, that we needed to present a united front. He said if I told you too early, you'd dig in your heels and we'd lose the opportunity. Stephen finally looked at me, his eyes pleading for understanding. He said this was best for both of us. Best for us? To sell our home? Without even discussing it? Karen, be reasonable. Stephen's voice took on that patient tone, like he was explaining something simple to someone slow. The house is falling apart. The roof needs replacing, that's $20,000 at least. The furnace is on its last legs. The property taxes went up again last year. We're hemorrhaging money on a house that's too big for two people. So the solution is to sell it? To let David give it to some developer who'll tear it down and build condos? The solution is to be practical. Stephen's frustration broke through his careful composure. We're not young anymore. I can barely get up the stairs without my knees screaming. You're exhausted all the time. This house requires work we can't do anymore, maintenance we can't afford. David's offering us a way out. A way out, I repeated slowly. Of our home. Our life. To somewhere easier, Stephen said, his voice softening. A nice condo, maybe one of those senior communities with the golf courses and the maintenance included. Somewhere we wouldn't have to worry about broken furnaces and leaking roofs. Wouldn't that be better? Better. Easier. More practical. The words landed like stones in my chest. When did you stop fighting? I asked quietly. What? Fighting. For anything. For us. For this. I gestured around the kitchen, the table where we'd eaten thousands of meals, the window over the sink where I'd watched David play in the backyard, the floor Stephen had installed himself, piece by piece. When did you decide that surrender was the same thing as peace? Stephen's face crumpled slightly. I'm tired, Karen. I'm 70 years old, I had a heart scare 3 years ago, and I'm tired. Is that so wrong? To want things to be easier? Not wrong, I said. Just sad. We sat in silence. The refrigerator hummed. The clock on the wall ticked, the same clock I'd bought at a yard sale in 1987, kept running with battery changes and hope. Stephen returned to his newspaper, the conversation apparently concluded in his mind. He turned to the business section, scanning headlines about markets and mergers, absorbed in a world that had nothing to do with us. And I realized, watching him, that I had become a ghost in my own life. Not suddenly. Gradually. Year by year, decision by decision, every time I'd said, whatever you think is best, or, you handle it, or stayed silent when I should have screamed. I'd faded. Transparent. Powerless. But powerless to whom? To Stephen, who couldn't even look at me while dismantling our life. To David, who'd learned from his father that my voice was optional, my opinion negotiable. Or to myself, for accepting invisibility as the price of peace. That night, long after Stephen had gone to bed still humming that goddamn tune like everything was fine, I couldn't sleep. I wandered through the dark house, touching walls and doorframes, saying silent goodbyes to a home I wasn't ready to lose. I ended up in Stephen's study, the room he'd claimed 20 years ago when his workshop became too painful for his arthritic hands. The room where he kept his tools now gathering dust, his projects abandoned, his files meticulously organized because organization was easier than creation. The filing cabinet was unlocked. Stephen had never been good with security, always trusted that people were basically good, basically honest. I found the folder marked estate planning and pulled it out. Inside, the trust documents David had brought 3 years ago. The papers we'd signed when Stephen was sick and I was scared and our son had seemed so helpful, so concerned, so trustworthy. I read them slowly this time, no longer the frightened wife too overwhelmed to ask questions. I read every word, every clause, every piece of legal language dense as concrete. And there, on page 7, clause 12. Property held in joint tenancy with right of survivorship. Transfer or disposition of said property during the lifetime of named parties requires written consent of all parties herein designated. Below it, Stephen's signature. My signature. And my name, still binding. Still necessary. Still legally powerful. I read the clause 3 times, my heart beginning to pound. The trust transferred the property into David's name upon our deaths. But during our lifetimes, we retain survivorship rights. Both of us. Any sale required both signatures. David needed me to sign. And I hadn't signed anything. I sat in Stephen's chair, surrounded by his abandoned hobbies and unused tools, holding papers that proved I wasn't as powerless as everyone, including me, had believed. The house was silent around me. Waiting. Listening. I thought about David's smug announcement at my birthday dinner. Stephen's complicit silence. The real estate agent's presumptuous excitement. All of them acting as if my consent was a formality, a rubber stamp, an inevitable surrender. They'd forgotten something crucial: you can't sell what you don't own. And they didn't own me. I pressed my palm flat against the desk Stephen had built in this room, solid oak, dovetailed joints, the work of a man who'd once known how to create something lasting. In the darkness, I whispered to myself, to the house, to the woman I was about to become. Maybe I'm not as powerless as they think. The words hung in the air like a promise. Or a threat. The county clerk's office opened at 8 a.m. I was awake at 5:30, watching the darkness outside our bedroom window slowly fade to gray, then pink, then the pale blue of October morning. Stephen slept beside me, snoring softly, oblivious. I wondered if he'd always been this good at sleeping through storms, or if it was a skill he developed over years of practice. At 7:45, I went downstairs and made coffee. My hands were steady as I measured the grounds, filled the reservoir, pressed the button. The familiar gurgle and hiss felt like a benediction. Normal sounds in a house that had become a battleground. At exactly 8:01, I dialed the number I'd looked up the night before. County Clerk's Office, Property Records Division. A woman's voice, already tired despite the early hour. Yes, hello. My name is Karen Harrell. I need to verify the ownership requirements for a property at 1847 Maple Drive. I kept my voice professional, businesslike. As if I did this sort of thing every day. As if I wasn't a 68-year-old woman who'd spent most of her life being told she didn't understand complicated things. One moment, please. I heard typing, the click of a keyboard, the ambient sounds of an office coming to life. Outside the kitchen window, a cardinal landed on the fence, bright red against the gray morning, impossibly vibrant. Okay, I have the property pulled up. What specifically did you need to know, Mrs. Harrell? The property is currently held in joint tenancy, correct? More typing. Yes, that's correct. Joint tenancy with right of survivorship between Karen Harrell and Stephen Harrell, established. She paused, 1985, with a deed update in 2022. 3 years ago, when David had brought those papers and we'd signed them in fear and trust. What are the requirements for selling or transferring a property held in joint tenancy? I asked. Both parties listed on the deed must consent to any sale or transfer during their lifetimes, the clerk said, her tone shifting slightly, becoming more careful, like she sensed something beneath my calm questions. It's right there in the joint tenancy designation. Both signatures are required for any disposition of the property while both owners are living. My heart was pounding now, but my voice remained steady. So the property cannot be sold without both signatures? Even if it's been placed in a family trust? A family trust doesn't override joint tenancy rights, she said. The trust determines what happens to the property after death, but during the owner's lifetimes, both joint tenants retain full rights. Any sale would require both parties' written consent. Even if one party initiated the sale? Even then. Both must sign. That's the whole point of joint tenancy, it protects both parties equally. I closed my eyes, letting the words sink into my bones. Equal protection. Both parties. My signature, as necessary as Stephen's. As powerful as David's schemes. Thank you, I said quietly. That's exactly what I needed to know. Is there anything else I can help you with, Mrs. Harrell? No. You've helped more than you know. After I hung up, I stood at the kitchen window for a long moment, watching the cardinal preen its feathers. It seemed impossibly confident, perched on that fence, vibrant and unafraid. Be like the cardinal, I thought. Be bright. Be bold. Be impossible to ignore. I found the real estate agent's business card in the stack of papers David had left behind, Janet Morehouse, Platinum Realty, with a glamour shot headshot and a tagline that promised white glove service for discerning clients. She'd called twice yesterday, leaving chirpy voicemails about moving forward with the timeline and exciting next steps. Each message had felt like a knife, a reminder that my home was being treated like a transaction, my life like inventory to be liquidated. I dialed her number. She answered on the second ring. Janet Morehouse speaking. How can I help you achieve your real estate dreams today? The relentless perkiness made my teeth hurt. Ms. Morehouse, this is Karen Harrell. I believe my son David has been working with you regarding the property at 1847 Maple Drive. Oh, Mrs. Harrell. Yes, wonderful to hear from you. Her enthusiasm cranked up even higher, if that was possible. I'm so excited about this sale. The buyers are absolutely thrilled, they've already secured financing, and we're scheduled for inspections next Tuesday. I just need to coordinate a time to come by and get your signature on the final documents. Would tomorrow work? I could come by around 10. There's been a mistake, I said calmly. I'm sorry? A mistake. I'm not signing anything. Silence. Then, cautiously, I'm not sure I understand, Mrs. Harrell. Your son indicated that you and your husband were both fully on board with this sale. The contract is already drawn up. Then the contract was drawn up without my knowledge or consent. But Mr. Harrell assured me, your son, David Harrell, he said this was a family decision. That you were downsizing, that the house was too much to maintain. My son, I said, each word precise and sharp, does not have the authority to sell my home without my consent. Which he does not have and will not receive. I could hear Janet's breathing change, quickening with what might have been panic or irritation or both. Mrs. Harrell, I think there may be some confusion here. This is all very routine. Estate planning, downsizing, it's what people do at your stage of life. I'm sure once you understand the financial benefits. I understand perfectly. My voice remained calm, but underneath it ran a current of steel I hadn't known I possessed. I understand that my son arranged to sell my home without my permission. I understand that you've been working on a contract without securing consent from all necessary parties. And I understand that if you, your buyers, or anyone else attempts to proceed with this sale without my explicit written consent, I will pursue legal action for fraud and breach of fiduciary duty. Now, Mrs. Harrell, let's not be hasty. I'm not being hasty. I'm being clear. The property at 1847 Maple Drive is held in joint tenancy. Do you know what that means, Ms. Morehouse? Of course, but it means both owners must consent to any sale. My signature is not a formality. It's a legal requirement. And you don't have it. Janet's professional veneer was cracking now. Your son said you would sign. The buyers have already put down earnest money. If this falls through because of some family squabble. This isn't a squabble, I interrupted. This is me exercising my legal rights over my own property. If your buyers lose their earnest money, perhaps they should have ensured all necessary parties actually consented to the sale before committing their funds. Mrs. Harrell, please. I've been very clear, Ms. Morehouse. If anyone touches my house, enters my property, or continues to treat my home as if it's already sold, I will see you in court. All of you. My son included. I didn't wait for her response. I hung up. For a moment, I just stood there, phone in hand, my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. My hands were shaking now, but not from fear. From adrenaline. From power. From the sheer, overwhelming rush of finally, using my voice as something other than background noise in my own life. The house seemed to settle around me, floorboards creaking softly, as if in approval. The morning light through the kitchen window turned the dust motes into gold, and I thought about all the mornings I'd stood in this exact spot, watching this exact light, believing I was powerless. What a waste. What a terrible, tragic waste of years. I made myself another cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table, the table Stephen had built from scrap lumber in 1986, sanded smooth and sealed with polyurethane he'd applied in 6 careful coats. I ran my hand along the edge, feeling the slight imperfections, the places where the grain hadn't quite matched up but Stephen had made it work anyway. This table had held 40 years of meals. Homework sessions and bill-paying marathons and late-night conversations and morning silences. David had eaten his first solid food sitting in a high chair pulled up to this table. Stephen and I had argued over money and made up over coffee and planned our future in the space between the salt shaker and the sugar bowl. And David had wanted to sell it. Probably planned to toss it in a dumpster along with everything else that didn't fit his vision of our downsized, manageable future. Over my dead body. I heard Stephen's footsteps on the stairs around 9:30, his familiar shuffle step that meant his knees were bothering him. He appeared in the kitchen doorway in his bathrobe, hair standing up on one side, looking confused. "You're up early," he said. "Couldn't sleep." He poured himself coffee and started toward the table, then stopped. Something in my posture, maybe. Or the way I was looking at him, direct, unflinching, no longer willing to be the first to look away. "What's wrong?" he asked. "I made some phone calls this morning." Stephen's hand tightened on his coffee mug. "What kind of calls?" "The county clerk's office. The real estate agent David's been working with." I kept my voice level, conversational. "Interesting conversations. Karen. Did you know that the house can't be sold without my signature?" I asked. "Both of us have to consent. Joint tenancy. Both owners equally protected." Stephen's face went pale. "Of course I knew that." "Then you also knew David couldn't actually sell the house without my permission. Which makes your week of silence even more interesting, doesn't it? He said you'd agree once you understood the benefits. He assumed I'd be too scared or too stupid or too obedient to say no." I stood, facing him across the kitchen we'd built together. "You all did. David. That real estate agent. You. You all assumed my consent was a formality. That's not fair." "What's not fair," I said quietly, "is 43 years of marriage where my voice became optional. Where my opinion was something to be managed rather than considered. Where I learned to disappear so thoroughly that my own family forgot I existed." Stephen's eyes filled with tears. "I never forgot you existed. Didn't you?" I asked. "When's the last time you asked what I wanted? Really asked, and waited for an answer, and actually cared what I said?" He opened his mouth, closed it again. No answer came. "I called Janet Morehouse this morning," I continued. "Told her the sale isn't happening. Told her if anyone tries to proceed without my explicit written consent, I'll pursue legal action." "You what?" Stephen's voice cracked. "I protected what's ours. Karen, the offer is for $300,000. "I don't care if it's for $3 million, I said. "This house is not for sale. Not to David's developer cousin. Not to anyone. Not without my consent, which I am not giving." Stephen sank into a chair like his strings had been cut. "David's going to be furious. Then David can be furious. He needed this sale." "For what?" I demanded. "What exactly did our son need our home for, Stephen?" "I don't know," Stephen admitted, his voice small. "He just said it was important. Time sensitive. That we'd understand when it was all over. We'd understand, I repeated. After it was too late to object. After our home was sold and demolished and turned into whatever makes David's developer cousin the most profit. I walked to where Stephen sat, this man I'd loved for 43 years, this man who'd slowly surrendered every piece of himself until there was nothing left but habits and humming and the path of least resistance. I'm not angry at you, I said quietly. I'm disappointed. But mostly, I'm done. Done with what? Done disappearing. Done being managed. Done letting other people make decisions about my life and telling myself it's easier than fighting. I picked up my coffee cup and headed toward the door. Where are you going? Stephen asked. To the garden. The rose bushes need deadheading, and I've been putting it off. I paused in the doorway. You should call David. Tell him the sale isn't happening. Or don't. Either way, it won't change anything. Karen. I found my voice, Stephen, I said. After all these years of silence, I finally found it. And I'm not giving it back. I left him sitting at the kitchen table, probably already reaching for his phone to call David, to apologize, to explain that his wife had suddenly developed opinions and boundaries and the audacity to say no. Let him explain. Let them both try to understand. I had rosebushes to tend and a home to protect and a life to reclaim. And for the first time in longer than I could remember, I knew exactly who I was and what I was worth. I was Karen Harrell. I was 68 years old. And I was not powerless. Not anymore. David's BMW pulled into the driveway at 3:47 p.m., fast enough to leave skid marks on the concrete Stephen had poured in 1987. I was in the garden, kneeling in the dirt among the rosebushes, my hands deep in soil that held 40 years of careful tending. I didn't stand when I heard his car door slam. Didn't rush to greet him or smooth my hair or prepare myself for confrontation. Just kept working the earth, pulling weeds from around the peace roses I'd planted the year David was born. What the hell did you do? His voice cut across the yard, sharp with barely controlled fury. I looked up slowly to see him striding toward me, still in his suit, charcoal gray, expensive, the kind of armor successful men wear when they want to intimidate. Mara trailed several steps behind, her face carefully neutral, a woman who'd learned when to make herself small. I sat back on my heels and wiped my hands on my gardening apron, the faded blue one with soil stains that would never come out. Hello, David. Mara. Don't. He stopped 3 feet away, towering over me the way he had since he was 16 and first realized he was bigger than his mother. Don't act like this is a social call. Janet Moorhouse called me an hour ago. She said you threatened her. That you're refusing to sign. That you've killed the entire deal. That's correct. His jaw clenched so hard I could see the muscle jump. Do you have any idea what you've done? I exercise my legal rights over my own property, I said calmly. Something I should have done 3 years ago when you brought those trust papers. This wasn't some impulse listing, Mom. This was months of work. Negotiations. A solid offer from serious buyers. The kind of opportunity that doesn't come twice in real estate. Then I suppose you'll have to live with missing it. I stood slowly, my knees protesting, and faced my son. He was taller, younger, angrier. But I didn't feel small. The house isn't for sale, David. It's not your decision to make. Actually, I said, brushing dirt from my jeans, it's exactly my decision to make. Joint tenancy. I looked it up. Both owners must consent. I didn't consent 3 years ago when you had us sign those papers, and I'm certainly not consenting now. His face flushed dark red. This is insane. You're being completely irrational. Irrational? I kept my voice level, which seemed to enrage him more. You announced at my birthday dinner, David, that you were selling my home in 2 days. You manipulated your father into keeping it secret for a week. You treated 40 years of our lives like it was just another real estate transaction. And I'm irrational for saying no? You don't understand the financial realities. He was shouting now, his professional veneer cracking. This house is bleeding you dry. When was the last time you could actually afford to fix anything? The roof is shot, the furnace is ancient, the property taxes keep going up. We've managed for 40 years. You've been barely surviving. Living in denial while this house falls apart around you. His hands clenched into fists at his sides. I was trying to help you. Give you a chance to cash out while you still could, before this place becomes completely worthless. How generous, I said quietly. Selling our home without asking. Such helpful children we raised. Stephen appeared on the back porch then, his face pale and drawn. David, please. Let's all calm down. Stay out of this, Dad. David's voice was ice. You already agreed this was the right move. Don't back out now just because Mom's being difficult. Difficult, I repeated. The word tasted like copper in my mouth. Is that what I am when I refuse to disappear on command? You're being selfish. David's voice cracked with genuine emotion now, desperation bleeding through the anger. You're thinking about yourself and not considering what's best for everyone. What's best for everyone? I laughed, sharp and bitter. Or what's best for you, David? Something flickered across his face. Fear. Shame. The look of a man caught in a lie he'd almost convinced himself was truth. Why do you need this sale? I asked quietly. The real reason. Not the story about helping us downsize or making things easier. Why do you actually need us to sell this house? The silence stretched long enough for the wind to pick up, rustling through the maple tree Stephen's father had planted 50 years ago. My business hit some complications, David said finally, each word forced out like pulling teeth. Bad investments. A development deal that fell through. I'm leveraged on some properties that, the market shifted. I need capital to cover the gap. There it was. The truth, naked and ugly in the afternoon light. So you were going to sell our house, I said slowly, to pay off your business debts. It's not that simple. It's exactly that simple. I felt something inside me crystallize into diamond-hard clarity. You needed money. You looked at us, at your aging parents in their paid-off home, and you saw an asset you could liquidate. That's not fair. Fair? The word came out like a slap. You want to talk about fair? Your father and I worked ourselves to exhaustion to give you advantages we never had. We paid for your education, your car, your business startup capital. We co-signed loans we could barely afford. We gave you everything. And I'm supposed to what, feel guilty about that forever? David's voice turned cold, crystalline with contempt. You chose to make those sacrifices. I didn't ask to be born into a family that could barely make ends meet. I didn't ask for parents who confused deprivation with love. Stephen made a sound like he'd been punched in the gut. I stared at this man, this stranger wearing my son's face, and felt the last threads of maternal hope finally snap. You're right, I said quietly. You didn't ask to be born. But we chose to love you anyway. We chose to build you a foundation of sacrifice and generosity and the belief that family meant something more than transactions. I walked to the porch where Stephen stood trembling, picked up the folder I'd left on the table that morning, and returned to David. I held out the property documents, the trust papers, the deed, the legal proof of ownership that still bore my name. You sold what wasn't yours, I said. This house was built by our sweat, our blood, our 40 years of believing in something bigger than profit margins. It was never your asset to leverage. It was our life. David stared at the papers but didn't take them. His hands remained at his sides, fisted tight. I knew you'd grown distant, I continued, my voice steady despite the tears now streaming down my face. I watched you become someone who values property over people, profit over principle. But I never thought, my voice caught. I never thought you'd try to erase me entirely. To treat me like a signature you could forge or a problem you could manage around. I reached up to my left hand and slowly twisted off my wedding ring. The simple gold bands Stephen had saved 3 months to afford, the one I'd worn for 43 years through poverty and pride and every shade of disappointment in between. I set it on the porch table, next to the property deed. The sound it made, metal on wood, was soft but final. These were both promises, I said. Commitments made with the belief that they meant something beyond paper and metal. That they were sacred. Stephen's sob broke the silence. The house deed was my promise to build something lasting. The ring was my promise to honor my commitments even when they became difficult. I looked at Stephen, then back at David. Both promises have been tested. One has held. One hasn't. David's face had gone white. What are you saying? I'm saying I'm disappointed, David. Not angry. Anger would require me to still believe you might change. I'm just profoundly, irreversibly disappointed that I raised someone capable of this level of betrayal. Mom, his voice cracked, suddenly sounding young again. Uncertain. You looked at your father's weakness and my silence and you saw permission, I continued. You thought because we'd always given you everything, we'd give you this too. Our home. Our security. Our final years of peace. You thought our love meant we had no boundaries. I was trying to help. You were trying to save yourself. The words were gentle but absolute. And you were willing to sacrifice us to do it. Mara shifted behind David, her face pale, her eyes wet. She'd been silent through all of this, a witness to her husband's unmasking. David, she said quietly. We should go. Not yet, David started. Now. Mara's voice was firm. We should go now. David looked at me, then at Stephen, then back at the house, the home he'd grown up in, learned to walk in, been loved in despite his failures to love back. For a moment, I saw something flicker across his face. Regret, maybe. Or just the recognition of a door closing that wouldn't open again. This is a mistake, he said, but his voice had lost its conviction. Yes, I agreed. It is. Just not the one you think. He turned without another word. Mara followed, her hand briefly touching my arm as she passed, a gesture of apology or solidarity or goodbye. I couldn't tell which. I watched them drive away, the BMW disappearing down Maple Drive, past the Johnsons' house where David had sold lemonade at age 7, past the corner where he'd learned to ride his bike, past all the landmarks of a childhood that had somehow produced this man I no longer recognized. Stephen collapsed into the porch chair, his hands covering his face, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. I picked up my wedding ring from the table and held it in my palm, feeling its familiar weight. After a long moment, I slipped it back on my finger. Not because Stephen had earned it. Not because the promise hadn't been broken. But because my commitment to myself, to honoring my own word, to being the person I'd promised to be, was separate from his failures. The ring stayed on my finger as a reminder that I kept my promises, even when others didn't. Even when it cost me everything. I sat down beside Stephen on the porch. The afternoon sun painted long shadows across the yard, across the garden I'd tended for 40 years, across the life I'd built and nearly lost and was now fighting to reclaim. It wasn't a victory, I would write later, in the journal I'd started keeping to document this unraveling. There was no triumph in watching my son reveal himself as someone I'd failed to recognize. No joy in discovering that love alone couldn't guarantee goodness. But sitting there on the porch Stephen had built with his own hands, watching the light fade over the home we'd sacrificed everything to create, I felt something shift inside me. Something breaking. And something stronger, harder, sharper, more fiercely my own, taking its place. David and Mara moved to Denver 3 weeks later. There was no goodbye dinner. No tearful farewell at the airport. No final attempt at reconciliation over coffee and explanations. Just a text message that arrived on a Tuesday morning while I was watering the peace roses. Moving truck comes Thursday. Won't need to stop by. Take care. I read it twice, then set my phone on the porch railing and returned to my watering. The roses were budding again, late bloomers that didn't know October meant they should be preparing for winter. I'd always loved that about them, their stubborn refusal to follow seasonal logic. Stephen stood at the kitchen window watching me. I could feel his gaze like a physical weight, but I didn't turn around. Not yet. The real estate deal collapsed within 48 hours of my conversation with Janet Morehouse. The developer pulled out, citing unforeseen complications with the title. David's business partner called twice, leaving increasingly angry voicemails about unprofessional conduct and breach of good faith. I listened to them once, then deleted them. Some endings don't deserve explanations. They just deserve to end. The house settled back into itself over the following weeks. The floorboards still creaked in the hallway. The furnace still rattled to life each evening as temperatures dropped. The ceiling crack in our bedroom remained unrepaired, that jagged line splitting our space in half. But everything felt different now. Lighter, somehow. Like a weight I hadn't known I was carrying had finally been set down. Stephen and I moved around each other those first days like dancers learning a new choreography, careful, uncertain, afraid of stepping on toes. We spoke in pleasantries and practical matters. Did you pay the electric bill? The coffee's almost out. I'm going to the store. It was Stephen who finally broke the silence that mattered. I was at the kitchen sink one evening, washing dinner dishes, when I felt him behind me. Not touching, just present in a way he hadn't been in years. I failed you, he said quietly. My hands stilled in the soapy water. I'd imagined this moment dozens of times over the past weeks, what I'd say, how I'd respond, whether I'd accept or reject or simply walk away. But now that it was here, I found I'd rehearsed the wrong script. I let fear make me a coward, Stephen continued. I was terrified of getting old, of being a burden, of not being able to take care of you the way I promised. And when David offered what sounded like a solution, an easy answer to all my failures, I took it. Because taking it was easier than fighting. Easier than asking what you wanted. Easier than being the man I swore to be 43 years ago. I turned off the water and dried my hands slowly, using the time to find words that weren't just anger or hurt. You weren't the only one who failed, I said, turning to face him. I disappeared too. Somewhere along the way, I stopped fighting for myself. I let you retreat into silence. I let David take and take and take. I became so accustomed to being invisible that I forgot I had a voice at all. Stephen's eyes were red-rimmed, exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. Can you forgive me? I thought about that question, really sat with it. Forgiveness wasn't a switch you flipped or a decision you made once and considered settled. It was a garden you tended daily, pulling weeds of resentment one at a time, hoping something new might grow in soil you thought was dead. I don't know yet, I answered honestly. But I'm willing to try. He nodded, accepting that truth the way he should have accepted all my truths weeks ago. That's more than I deserve. Probably, I agreed. Then, softer, but it's what I'm offering anyway. We started small. Stephen began fixing things he'd been putting off for years. The loose railing on the front porch that had wobbled since 2019. The kitchen drawer that had stuck for so long we'd stopped using it entirely. The garden gate that had been hanging crooked since the spring of 2023. Not because I asked. Not because I nagged or reminded or left him lists. But because he wanted to. Because rebuilding trust started with rebuilding the small, broken things. I started speaking up. About what I wanted for dinner, not whatever you want, but actual preferences. About which movie to watch. About whether I wanted to visit Stephen's sister for Thanksgiving or stay home for the first time in 30 years. I'd like to stay home, I said when he asked in mid-November. Stephen paused, clearly surprised. Really? We always go to Linda's. I know. But I'd like to have Thanksgiving here this year. In our own home. Just us. He studied my face for a long moment, then nodded. Okay. Yeah. That sounds good. Small things. Simple conversations. But they were the foundation of everything larger. We were learning to be partners again, not just roommates sharing a history and a mortgage. Like two old trees whose roots had grown tangled together over decades, damaged by storms but still standing, still capable of new growth. The house seemed to approve of our efforts. The settling creak sounded less like complaints and more like contentment. The morning light through the kitchen window felt warmer. Or maybe I was just finally paying attention again. I developed a new ritual. Every morning before Stephen woke, I'd take my coffee to the front porch and run my hand along the wooden railing he'd built in our third year here. The wood was weathered now, rough beneath my palm, splintering in places. But solid. Strong. "You're still here, Karen," I'd whisper to myself, to the house, to the woman I'd almost lost. "And so is your home." Some mornings I'd think about David. Wonder if he was happy in Denver, if his business had recovered, if he ever thought about the home he'd tried to erase or the mother he'd been willing to betray for a balance sheet that didn't balance. Mostly, though, I didn't wonder. Whatever David was building in Colorado was his to construct or destroy. I'd spent enough years trying to shore up his foundations while my own crumbled beneath me. It was time to tend my own ground. People from church would ask sometimes, their voices carefully neutral, "Have you heard from your son?" "No," I'd answer simply, without elaboration or apology. The first few times, I saw pity in their eyes. Poor Karen, estranged from her only child. But I didn't feel poor. I felt free. Free from the exhausting work of making myself smaller to accommodate someone else's expansion. Free from the belief that love meant endless sacrifice without reciprocity. Free from the crushing weight of invisibility I'd carried so long I'd forgotten what it felt like to be seen. I'd spent 68 years learning to disappear. Reclaiming my space took far less time than I'd feared. 6 months after that birthday dinner, Stephen and I sat on the front porch watching the sun set over the neighborhood we'd watched evolve for 4 decades. The Johnsons had sold their house to a young couple with twin toddlers. The Chens had repainted their shutters bright blue. The corner lot where the old Murphy place stood was now a community garden, raised beds full of tomatoes and zucchini and hope. Stephen's hand found mine, tentative, and I let him hold it. "No regrets?" he asked quietly. I thought about the question. About David's absence. About the fights we'd had and the tears we'd shed and the comfortable silence we were learning to rebuild from scratch. Some, I admitted. But not about this. Not about staying. The house stood solid behind us, every wall holding stories, every room containing memories both beautiful and painful. It wasn't perfect. The roof still needed replacing eventually. The furnace still rattled like it might give up any day. The crack in the bedroom ceiling remained unrepaired, a permanent scar we'd learned to live with. But it was ours. Built by our hands, sustained by our stubbornness, protected by a signature I'd finally learned was worth more than any amount someone else might offer. "I was thinking," Stephen said, breaking into my thoughts. "About that garden gate. I could rebuild it properly. Take it apart, replace the hinges, make sure it swings true." I looked at him, this man I'd loved and lost and was learning to love again differently. "I'd like that." "It won't be quick," he warned. "I'm out of practice. And my hands aren't what they used to be." "That's okay," I said. "We have time." And we did. Not infinite time, we were both too old to pretend otherwise. But enough time to rebuild what mattered, to tend what we'd neglected, to choose each other again with eyes wide open to all our failures and flaws. People talk about letting go as if it's always the brave choice. As if holding on makes you weak or stuck or unable to move forward. As if surrender is the only path to peace. But sometimes, holding on, even when your hands shake, even when everyone tells you to let go, even when the easier path gleams bright and tempting, is how you prove you were never invisible in the first place. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is simply refuse to disappear. I'm Karen Harrell. I'm 68 years old. I live in the home I built with my own hands on Maple Drive, where the peace roses bloom stubbornly into October and the floorboards creak a familiar song. My son lives in Denver now. We don't speak. That loss sits in my chest like a stone, heavy and permanent, but I've learned to carry it. My husband sits beside me on the porch he built, and we're learning, slowly, painfully, hopefully, how to be partners again instead of strangers sharing an address. The house stands behind us, around us, holding us in its frame the way we once held dreams of what our life might become. It's not the life I imagined at 25, pouring concrete in the July heat with my whole future ahead of me. It's harder. More complicated. Marked by losses I never anticipated and strengths I never knew I had. But it's mine. Claimed by a signature I finally learned to value. Protected by a voice I almost forgot I possessed. Every morning, I touch the weathered wood of the porch railing and whisper my reminder, "You're still here, Karen. And so is your home. Still standing. Still strong. Still mine." And that, despite everything, through everything, is enough.